So we are finishing up with our study of Elijah, as Pastor Mark had mentioned a little bit earlier. The passage that we come to tonight, I think, is kind of an odd passage. 1 Kings chapter 19 is where we're going to be. And I think it's odd because of what we have sort of seen in Elijah, sort of building up to last week, sort of that climactic event last week. I think it was Omar that kicked off our study of Elijah, if I'm not mistaken. And he did a great job of setting up what we were going to be studying over the course of the next few weeks, sort of setting the stage for Elijah as this hero. And so that's what we have seen from Elijah over this period of weeks, is this hero. And it's been building week after week as we've seen. The heroism of Elijah in speaking a drought. He speaks and there's a drought. We see him as he's being fed by ravens. I don't know how familiar you are with ravens. I mean, these are pretty big birds, and they're birds. It's just it's odd, but it sort of fits with Elijah. And then, of course, last week this huge event with the showdown. On the one side, you've got Elijah as the prophet of the one true God, and on the other, we have Ahab and the prophets of Baal, this false god. And we see as Elijah calls down fire from heaven, and he slaughters 400 of the prophets of Baal. Big event, heroic. When Omar was setting this up, I know he made some references to superheroes and kind of tied in the superhero, the comic book hero. The one I remember him specifically mentioning was Iron Man. I think that was the one that he mentioned. But if you start thinking about superheroes, what is it that makes them heroic? What is it that makes a superhero a superhero? It's a superpower. Superman has superhuman strength. He can fly, for crying out loud. X-ray vision. You've got Captain America, super strong. He can run. The Flash. He can runs as fast as lightning. There's a superpower that the superhero has, and it's one of the things that attracts us to read about him and watch the movies, the Marvel movies, if you're into that sort of thing. But there's something about that superpower. Just kind of looking in here, I think there are enough of us that are my age and younger. So your kids, I'm sure, have seen the movie. Those of you who are grandparents, you may have watched it with your grandkids. The Incredibles. You remember The Incredibles that came out, I want to say the early 2000s was when The Incredibles came out. It's the story of Mr. Incredible and this family of superheroes. And as the movie kicks off, Mr. Incredible, he's supposed to be going to his wedding to marry Elastigirl. And he kind of gets distracted because there's a crime in progress. So he goes and does what a superhero is going to do. He's going to, take care of the criminals and break that up. And in the process of that, if I remember, I think he goes to get back in his car, and in the car is this little kid named Buddy. And Buddy is sort of a Mr. Incredible groupie. He follows Mr. Incredible, everything Mr. Incredible does. He wants to grow up to be just like Mr. Incredible. Except Buddy's not a superhero. And Mr. Incredible doesn't really want to be bothered with this little, snot-nosed little kid following him around. And so he kind of gets rid of him, tells him to go away. I think the cops maybe come and take him home or whatever. And you sort of fast forward through the movie. Buddy has grown up. Buddy is now the villain in the movie. Rejected by Mr. Incredible, and so he has sort of set out his purpose in life is, he builds these, I think things for his wrists and his feet so he can fly, and he can shoot lasers or whatever. And the idea that Buddy has is he's going to make this all available to everybody. And he's got the line that he has in the movie, if you remember, if everyone is super, then no one is. There's something about a superpower and a superhero that sets them apart. It segregates them from us. We can't really relate to a superhero. We relate more to a human hero because the human hero is flawed. They're normal. They're more like us. We see a lot of these in sports. As I was preparing this, I kind of thought of Joe Namath. If you remember Joe Namath, Joe Willie Namath, Broadway Joe. Great football talent, great quarterback, great abilities. And he led the New York Jets to their first and their only Super Bowl title. Defeated, a team that was thought to be invincible in the Baltimore Colts. But you kind of fast forward through Joe Namath's career, and you get to the end of his career. And if I remember, he's with the LA Rams. He's got 2 bad knees. He's old. He's not merely an aging quarterback. He's an old quarterback, and the ability and the talent is not there. It's not what it once was. The skills are just not what they once were. And as much as you want to look away, watching him at the end of his career, you can't help but watch him because we're just attracted. We're drawn to the human hero, the hero who has those flaws. And so, as we've been going through the study of Elijah, we've been kind of building up, and in our own minds even, we kind of build him up as being this super heroic prophet. And then we get to chapter 19. And in chapter 19, what we see, and where we'll look at it tonight, is it's a reminder that Elijah is not just a superhero. He's human. He's a real person, a real man. And we see him, and it's kind of raw. And there's parts of it that as you read them and as you think about what he's actually saying in here, some of it is a little disturbing to see our hero this low. He's discouraged, he's depressed, he's despondent, he's fearful. But all of that makes him even more heroic, I think, because the frailty of Elijah that we see, I think makes him more relatable and makes him even more heroic. But in that sense, I think it's an odd passage because we don't really expect to see our hero so low. But there's an important message in there for us as we see that. The fear that we see in Elijah, the importance of guarding against that and trusting and keeping our eyes on the Lord. Because what we'll see happen is Elijah takes his eyes off the Lord. He looks down. And the result of looking down is never good. So we're going to be in chapter 19 of 1 Kings, if you want to turn there. We've only got 2 main points that we're going to look at tonight. These first 5 verses, I think, are where we see the hero's humanity. And then we're going to move from there. We'll see the hero's hope that comes out of that. So, starting in verse 1, chapter 19, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." And he lay down and slept under a broom tree. So the humanity of our hero on display. We see in verse 3, says that Elijah was afraid. He had fear. Intimidation, threats that have been made by Queen Jezebel. We've got Elijah, who's this great hero of faith. This is the one who's called down the fire from heaven. This is the one who has slaughtered all of the prophets of Baal just one chapter before. He's also a man of incredible humility. We have seen him as he has prayed these great prayers and has trusted God for his promises, and yet he crumbles in the face of these threats, in the face of this intimidation from the very ones he has just faced down. He's afraid. Verse 3 and 4 go on to tell us that he runs in the face of this newfound fear. And I guess if you read it, I guess if you are a hero and you're going to run, you run. Because Elijah goes, it says, to Beersheba. Now, Beersheba is about as far away as he can get from Ahab and Jezebel. It's in the southernmost portion of Judah. So he's gone about as far as he can get away. And then we're told from there he goes on another day's journey from there as well. So he is getting himself geographically as far away from these threats as you can possibly get. And it sort of reminds us of another prophet that we know all too well in Scripture, Jonah. Jonah is called by God to go where? To go to Nineveh. Jonah doesn't go to Nineveh, not immediately. He doesn't go near Nineveh. He doesn't go around Nineveh. He doesn't even stay put where he is. He gets on a boat and tries to sail in the complete opposite direction to get as far away from Nineveh as he can. That's kind of where we see Elijah now, taking himself as far to the south as he can possibly get. And it's interesting that if you go back and if you've paid attention in the prior chapters and note the number of times where what we read is, God said to him, go. The word of the Lord came to him, go. And here, there's no word of the Lord that came to Elijah and told him to flee from Jezebel or Ahab. He just goes. So he's tried to take himself as far away as he can possibly get from the mission that he's been given. And the question that we have to ask is why? Why does Elijah so fear Jezebel? Why do her intimidations and her threats, why do they scare him and frighten him so much? So much that he would run this far away from the post that he's been given. And the answer to that question, I think, serves as a great example, really a warning for us to guard against the same attitude of fear that Elijah has. So, why was Elijah so fearful? How did he get to this point? From where we just saw him, literally on this mountaintop experience that he just had. Well, first of all, he's not thinking clearly. That's the first thing to note here, is that he's not thinking clearly because he doesn't consider the source of the intimidations, the source of the threats. Because who is it that has threatened him? It's Jezebel. Yeah, it's Jezebel. And what do we know about Jezebel? She's a what? Neurotic. That's one way to describe her. She's evil. She's violent. Yeah, despicable. Yeah. Yeah, she's not a good person. We can describe her that way. She is a godless, unbelieving, God-opposing idolatress. But she's a godless, unbelieving, God-opposing, idolatrous human. Right? So Elijah is now listening to the threats of this human. Someone who has lived in just complete opposition to the very God who has empowered him for all of these great heroic acts that we've seen up until now. He's now listening to the human threatening him. In Psalm 56, David writes, "Be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me all day long, an attacker oppresses me. My enemies trample on me all day long, for many attack me proudly. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? When Elijah should have cried out to the Lord, confessing the fear, the weakness that he should have felt himself falling into, when he should have done that, asking the Lord for strength and standing in the strength of the Lord, what does he do? He runs. He runs away and he flees because he failed. First of all, he failed to consider the source. He wasn't thinking clearly, but he also had isolated himself. If you notice in verses 3 and then into 4, it says he came to Beersheba and he left his servant there. And then he goes on a full day's journey into the wilderness. So he's gone alone into the wilderness, we're told. Ecclesiastes 4, starting in verse 9, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, and one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm, but how can 1 keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. I think it's interesting, human nature, and how we tend to react when we become discouraged. Because one of the first things we tend to do is try to get away. Try to get away by ourselves and get alone when we're discouraged or when we're faced with discouragement. And that is almost in every case the absolute worst thing that we can do. It's the worst thing that Elijah could do, was to go off by himself, because discouraged people are lonely people, and lonely people are vulnerable people. Our isolation, when we pull ourselves away from others and we go off to be by ourselves in our discouragement, in our depression, it opens us up to spiritual attack. We're open to depression and anger, and the depression and anger and despondency that we're feeling increases even more as we're isolated. Peter talked about this. He said that our adversary is Satan, and that he prowls around like a lion, waiting and looking for the opportunity to devour. But it's Paul who reminds us in Romans 12, we're all individual members of a body, but we are one body. There is strength in that body. The principle all the way back into Genesis 2. God has created everything. He's created man, and he looks at man and he says what? He says, it is not good for the man to be alone. Now, in the context, he creates Eve and he gives him his helper, but the principle remains the same, that we're not to isolate ourselves. That's not how we are to act in these situations, like Elijah, because by isolating himself, he's opened himself up for even more doubt. He's opened himself up for even more discouragement and more fear. So he's gotten himself into this place of fear because he failed to consider the source. And he has now isolated himself, but he kind of gets caught out a little bit on the mountaintop. I mentioned earlier, I referenced the mountaintop experience. Well, this is a mountaintop experience of all mountaintop experiences. I've been a runner for, I guess it's probably a couple of decades now. I've run in several marathons, and you don't just go out and run in a marathon. You don't just decide to do that on a whim. There's a build up to the marathon. You have to train. You have to prepare for that moment. And then, Nate, I know you ran in one in December, so you know this as well. You're preparing for that moment. And the closer you get, there's an excitement that builds. And then you get to the day of, and you run this, and when you've completed it, there's this incredible feeling of accomplishment that you've really done something. Wow, I ran a marathon, and it never fails that usually it's a few days later. You're still sore, but in your mind you start thinking, okay, well, gosh, what now? what's next? And there's some discouragement that kicks in. There's a little bit of depression that kicks in now. You think about your own, our own salvation experiences and that mountaintop experience. I was saved in youth camp one summer. I was 14. We were literally up on a mountain. And, those of you who have been to youth camp, summer youth camps in a church setting, you kind of know how it's set up. Usually you get up there on a Monday, come back on a Friday. Every night there's a service, kind of builds up to the big service is always on Thursday night, at least it was for us. And it was at that Thursday night service that I finally responded to the call and gave my life to Christ. Then we came back, literally came down off the mountain. We came back home, and many of you have experienced this as well. It's sort of like, okay, gosh, I was up on the mountain, and now life is just going on around me, and what do I do now? Now what happens? Our most vulnerable moments almost always follow a great victory. And it's in those times where we most need to prepare and to set up a defense against the enemy. That's what Elijah failed to do. Luke chapter 14, Jesus has been invited to eat at the house of a Pharisee on the Sabbath, and he heals a man there. And of course, you got Pharisees there, and so as Jesus was wont to do, he has now incurred another confrontation with the Pharisees over this. And as he leaves there are throngs of people that are now beginning to follow him around. And he turns to them and he says, those who would follow ought to consider the cost of following me. Consider the cost of following me and plan accordingly. Elijah has just defeated the prophets of Baal. He slaughtered them. He's got energy and excitement, surely, that's at a peak in that moment. But he left himself vulnerable because he thought the battle was over. And it was just beginning. He hadn't considered what the cost of his victory would be. And so he hadn't planned for that. Ahab and Jezebel, they're not simply going to sit back and just brush that off. They're not going to let it go. I mean, he slaughtered all of the prophets, the priests of Baal. That's kind of a big deal if you're Ahab and Jezebel. They're not going to just let that go. But see, on the mountaintop, as he's bathing in the victory that he's had, he got caught without considering what the cost of that victory would be, and it left him in a vulnerable place. So he gets caught out a little on the mountaintop, and that sort of feeds into this fear that he now has. But he was physically exhausted, and he was emotionally spent. He's been public enemy number one for years now. If you think about it in the FBI's most wanted list, he's at the top of Ahab and Jezebel's list. Really the only name that needs to be on there is Elijah. He's been living in the wilderness. He's been close to starvation. And then that mountaintop experience, the confrontation, the slaughtering of the prophets, that great victory, and all of this has led to a point where he's at the end of his rope. He's done. He's physically done. He's emotionally done. And as a result, he's spiritually at the end as well. He's been going full speed. He's been going full bore, 24/7 for years. There's an old Greek saying that you will break the bow if you keep it always bent. If you take the bow, and you think of a bow and arrow, and you've always got that bow bent, at some point it's just going to break. Back in Genesis, the end of Genesis chapter 1 and going over into chapter 2, God sets a principle for us. He sets an example of rest. He's created. 6 days he's created. Seventh day he rests from his work. Why is it that we so often ignore the principle of rest that God set for us then? We ignore it. We forget it. Culturally, I know here, we've got this great American work ethic, and it's been a great work ethic for us. We've worked and we've built You look at what we've done and what we've accomplished in this country, but at what cost has it been to relationships? What it's been to families? This unceasing work ethic that we have. Pastors, those in the ministry, are certainly not immune from that as well. It's hard. Ministry is hard. There's heavy burdens that are borne in the ministry, and too often you see those in ministry get beaten down, weighed down with these burdens, and they're defeated, and too many end up leaving the ministry altogether. Our tendency is to work without ceasing, and the effects of that on relationships, on ministry, on our health, they're never good. If you keep the bow always bent, it will eventually break. I mean, God made it as clear as he could make it there in Genesis that we are to rest. That's what he had intended. That's what he had designed for us. So Elijah gets caught in that as well. He's just physically, emotionally at the end. But then we see, as we go into verses 4 and 5, the end of verse 4 and going into verse 5, we see him get lost in self-pity. Verse 4, he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." And he lay down and slept under the broom tree. So he's in this sort of the cycle of self-pity that he finds himself in. And it's the result of this unreasonable standard that he has created. That's what self-pity results from. We create an unreasonable standard for ourselves, usually from whole cloth. We sort of make it up in our own mind. And then, surprise, surprise, we fail to meet the unreasonable standard we've met because it really can't be met. And we end up in this self-pity, this cycle of self-pity where we're sort of living in this self-induced victim mentality that we have. It's sort of always living in the worst case scenario. And it's all imagined. We've sort of made it up. We've created this standard for ourselves that we can't possibly meet. And what does Elijah say here? He says, "I'm no better than my fathers," is his complaint. "I'm no better than my fathers." Well, whoever said he had to be? Who told him he had to be better than his fathers? Who told him that he even had to be the same as his fathers? It's this unrealistic standard that he has created that now leads him into this sort of whiny self-pity that he has. But you sort of listen and read to what he's saying here. Now just let me die. That's where self-pity leads. This attitude that leads to, I'm not good enough. Nobody needs me. I'd be better off dead. And that's where Elijah is here. He's got this unreasonable standard he's created. The only standard that actually matters is God's standard. It's not these made-up imaginary standards that we've created. It's God's standard. And, of course, God's standard, his law, his commandments, we already know we can't meet that standard. We can't. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We're not going to meet that standard. And the good news is we don't have to, because Jesus met that standard for us. Jesus is the one who paid the price for us failing to meet that standard. So we finally here in these first few verses of chapter 19, we see the humanity of our hero. We kind of built him up as being super heroic, and now we see he's afraid, he's got fear, he's not thinking clearly, he's exhausted. Physically, he's exhausted. Emotionally, he's exhausted. Spiritually, he's at the end. And he's just sort of in this self-pitying cycle where he's actually wishing he would die and asking to die. We see him now in all of that. The discouragement, the depression, the fear, the hopelessness that he has. We're not to live in a spirit of hopelessness. Neither was Elijah. And so what we see from this, as we continue reading, though, is his hope. There's a hope that Elijah has, and that's what we're going to look at now in beginning at the end of verse 5. "And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, Arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. And he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. Elijah's hope was always found in nothing less than God's mercy and grace. Our exhausted, depressed, discouraged, fearful, possibly now suicidal hero. And in his low moment, God meets his servant with mercy. And notice how he demonstrates this mercy to Elijah, because it's the same as how he demonstrates it with us. First of all, the Lord gives him rest and refreshment. He meets his physical need. And it gives him physical rest. Elijah is starving. He's hungry. He's tired physically. He's just broken. So hungry, thirsty, exhausted. This broken body. Think about in the context of sharing the gospel, or in your work in any kind of evangelism that you have done as you've gone out and you've shared. And it may be here locally. It may be. I think it's easier sometimes to see as you go out, possibly out of the country, and you go into poorer areas where the people are just they don't have anything, and their bellies are empty. And it's a type of emptiness we don't really understand, that level of hunger, I don't think. But you think about how a gospel message is received, a spiritual message is received in that physical state of complete starvation and hunger and exhaustion. When you're really hungry, a weakened body usually results in a weakened mind, and that usually leads to a weakened spirit as well. It's difficult when your physical needs have not been met to focus your attention on the spiritual and to focus on what truly matters. But that's what we face. I think our own nature, as we kind of think about us here in this room, here in this church, the wisdom of learning to say no rather than always saying yes. And this is something that I have struggled with for years. My wife is sitting back there. She can tell you that I struggle to say no. When I'm asked to help, when I'm asked to do something, I don't like saying no. And too often, when you don't learn to say no when you need to say no, you end up in a state kind of like Elijah, where you're just physically exhausted. You just don't have more that you're able to give. The result oftentimes is burnout. We burn out. The physical toll, it takes a toll on us mentally and emotionally as well. And think about our decision making when we're exhausted. When you have been, I'm talking about just exhausted, how well do you make decisions? I'm guessing not very well. Just show of hands. What's the longest that you've gone without sleep? Let's start with 20 hours. Raise your hand. If you've gone 20 consecutive hours without sleep, okay, 20 hours is a long time. How about 30? Hands up if you've gone 30 hours. Not quite as many hands up. How about 40? Gone 40 hours without sleep. All right, we got a few up. How about 50? We got one right here. 50. 40 or 50? 54. Okay, 54. That's a lot of hours. I remember the last mission trip that I went on with Pastor Wade. See back there, and Pastor David and Nate was with us as well. I don't sleep on airplanes. I don't know. I've never been able to sleep on an airplane. I can't get comfortable. My back's uncomfortable. Sitting upright, I just can't do it. And so the last trip that we were on, from the moment I woke up the morning we were leaving until the time we got into the hotel at our destination, including the flights and the layovers, it was 60 hours. I didn't sleep for 60 hours. That's absurd. And I can tell you right now that the only decision that I could possibly make in that moment when we finally got to where we were going was whether my head was supposed to go on this end of the bed or on that end of the bed. We just don't make good decisions when we're exhausted. And so that's what we see here in Elijah. And what we see first is God feeding and meeting his most immediate need, the physical need that he has, before he addresses his more important need. So he's provided him rest and refreshment, first of all, in meeting that physical need, but then he meets the spiritual needs as well. The physical need, he's been fed, he's been given water, and we're told that he leaves. He goes 40 days and 40 nights. He is led to Horeb. And so he's gone, maybe not in perfect obedience, but he's gone in obedience. And that's really what resting requires trust. It requires us to trust in God. First of all, taking a day off, I'm trusting that I have to, that this place isn't going to fall apart just because I'm not here for a day. I'm trusting in that. But to rest, to really rest, requires trust. And that trust leads to obedience. And so a lack of resting is also it's a lack of obedience. As I trust the Lord more, I become more obedient. As I obey more, I trust more. And the reverse is also true. The less I trust, the less obedient I'm going to be. And the less obedient I'm going to be, the less I'm going to trust. And so both ends of that are sort of feed off of that same cycle. And so here's Elijah now, physical needs met. 40 days, 40 nights, he's led to Horeb. Physical needs met, spiritual needs met. And of course, ultimately for the believer, for us as believers, our rest is found in Christ and what Christ has done for us. And that's really what this points to. God has established the Sabbath day for rest, pointing us to our ultimate, permanent rest that we find only in his Son, Jesus, the Messiah, come to provide the ultimate, certainly physical, but spiritual rest, and to do so permanently. So Elijah, years without rest, he's gone. Years of sort of building up to this confrontation with Ahab and the prophets of Baal and Jezebel and the burnout that he experiences and the brokenness and the despair. And God responds in exactly the way Elijah needs him to respond here, in exactly the right moment. There's not a lecture. He doesn't blame Elijah. He just shows him mercy, gives him rest. He gives him refreshment. And so we see that hope that's coming to him. God also provides him with reassurance and reaffirmation, because he reminds him, he reassures him of who God is, and then also who man is. Verses 9 and 10 says, "There he came to a cave and lodged in it, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?' He said, 'I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away.' And he said, 'Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord.'" So going a little into verse 11 there, but it's a simple question. "Elijah, what are you doing here?" And Elijah's response makes it pretty clear that he's bought into the big lie. The lie of, I'm all alone. It's just me. I'm the only one. No one else can understand what's happening, what I'm going through. And it's not just Elijah that falls into that trap. We have the same attitude, the same belief too. Anytime we think that there's a ministry burden that we're bearing on our own, we're just like Elijah here. I'm all alone. Nobody else is here. Nobody else understands what's happening. God reassures him of who God is. 11 and 13, what we see is Elijah has really taken his eyes off of the Lord. He's taken his focus off of the Lord. Verse 11, he said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord, and behold, the Lord passed by. And a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?'" So he's taken his focus, taking his eyes off of the Lord, which is the same. Look, we do the same thing. We have this tendency to take our eyes off of the Lord, especially in good times. It's easy to do when things are going well. We begin to sort of rely on our own strength. We rely on our own power. We rely on our own understanding because things are just going so easy. Things are going so well for us. Or we start to focus in the bad times on how poorly things are going. And, we begin to believe that, like Elijah has believed, I'm the only one. No one else is going through this. And we start to notice what's going on around us more than we're focusing on the Lord. We focus on the noise. That's what my dad always called it, was noise. And the noise looks and sounds something like this. You get a nail in your tire, right? You get a nail in your tire. Now you got to go take the car in. You got to get a new tire, or you got to get it patched. About the time you get that done, get back home, there's your washer has gone out, not working anymore. Refrigerator has gone out. So now you got to get an appliance. You got to replace that. About the time you're getting that done, the toilet is backed up, or your septic is backed up. And it seems that there's one thing right after another. Why are all of these things happening all at the same time to me? And the reality is, these things were always there. It's just you've taken your eyes, you've taken your focus off of the Lord, and now you've really noticed the nail in the tire. And because you've noticed and you've started to focus on that nail in the tire, now you notice the washer that's out. And okay, now I've got a nail in the tire, I got the washer is out, now I gotta go, there's a toilet that's not working, I gotta go take care of that also. These things were always there, but this is noise. And my dad always told me, don't listen to the noise. It's just noise. Don't take your eyes, don't take your focus off of what you should be focused on, which is serving the Lord. Focusing on Him, keeping our eyes on Him. Peter learned this lesson as well, the hard way, right? He's out, he's walking on the water. Jesus has told him, "Come on, Peter, walk." And he's focusing, he's looking at Jesus, he's walking on the water, and then all of a sudden he notices the noise. He sees, wait a minute, I'm on water. And there's waves, and there's wind, and there's rain, and plump, down he goes. Took his eyes off of Jesus, and he goes down. So it's in a gentle whisper that God speaks to Elijah, that he hears him. And what he says, what he teaches Elijah here is, Elijah, I am God. I've got this. I've always had this. You need to trust and focus on me. See, God gets Elijah here literally out of the cave, out of that dark cave, that dark place that he's in, and brings him into the light. And it's in the light where we're encouraged. It's in the light where we find our hope. And so that's what God does for Elijah here in this. He reassures him, reminds him of who he is, who God is. But then he also reaffirms him. Because we just read there at the end of verse 13, we saw Elijah with this sort of whiny complaint earlier. Now here he is. He's God is now in the gentle breeze, the gentle whisper, and he asks him again, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And it's sort of this same, now very empty whine that we hear from Elijah. But notice how God shows him mercy in this. Starting in verse 14, he said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord." This is Elijah. the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And the Lord said to him, Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. So he reaffirms Elijah here. The original complaint that Elijah makes, God reassures him, reminds him of who he is, but now God reminds him that he's not done with Elijah yet. There's still a job to do, and Elijah is still God's man for that job. And he says, oh, by the way, Elijah, you're not the only one. You're not alone in this. And think about the effect that this type of reaffirmation has on Elijah. The reaffirmation by God of who God was, but then also who Elijah was as well. Words of affirmation or reaffirmation spoken to someone, it's amazing the effect that it has on them. I referenced earlier the difficult job that a pastor has in ministry, and the burdens that they bear, and the weight that they often carry. Affirmation of them, just, hey, I'm thinking about you, I'm praying for you, I love you, I appreciate you. The effect and the impact of that is not something to just be ignored, and it does so much to reinvigorate and to remind someone of the important work that they're doing and the important call that they have. And that's what that's what God has done for Elijah here, is just to reaffirm him. So he's reassured him, he's reaffirmed him, but then he goes on to allow him to be re-energized and to refocus. Verse 19. So he departed from there and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen in front of him, and he was with the 12th. Elijah passed by him and cast his cloak upon him. And he left his oxen and ran after Elijah and said, Let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you. And he said to him, Go back again, for what have I done to you? We see in here the impact of a companion, because what God has done is he's not merely allowed Elijah to anoint his successor. He's given him a trusted friend. He's given him a real companion. And what does a friend provide? A friend provides encouragement. A friend ministers to a friend. There's burdens that are shared. There's, a friend will laugh with you and cry with you, share the burden with you. And you think about this in the context here of McGregor in our life groups. Think about the effectiveness of those who are a part of a life group, a smaller group where there's that connectedness, and their ministry activity, their desire to serve, their actual service, versus those who, you might call them the pew warriors, the ones who just show up on a Sunday morning, sit on a pew in the back, they do their hour of church, they go home. There's no connection there. But Elijah here has been given a companion. There's a connectedness, and it's in that connection that we find encouragement from one another, that we're able to bear the burdens together. So years of toiling away by Elijah, the isolation, and now someone to share the burdens with him and minister to Elijah just as he had been ministering to the people. So he's re-energized in that, but he's also able to refocus, because there's not only is there an impact of a companion, but we also see the impact on a companion. Because what does Elijah say right there at the end? He says, Go back again, for what have I done to you? There's a concern that Elijah expresses here for Elisha. Elijah knows full well what awaits Elisha. Elisha now stepping into his ministry role, accepting his call as the successor to Elijah. Elijah knows what he's in for. Now, Elijah has lived it. And there's this concern, the pain, the frustration, the loneliness, the fear that he's felt, the rejection that he's felt, but also Elijah understands the importance of the mission that he's been given. He understands also the joy of serving. There's I don't know if it's an age in life. I think it's more of a stage in life that and I think we all tend to come to it, where we realize the importance of the generation to come, the generation behind us. And we realize and recognize the ability that we have, but also the responsibility that we have to impact that generation. In your early years, where it's just you and your spouse, your focus is really on the two of you. But then kids come along, and all of a sudden, oh my goodness, there's this small person who I got to feed them, I got to clothe them. I mean, this kid can't even poop by himself. I got to take care of that also. I got to pour myself into this little one and raise him up. And then I haven't reached the grandparent stage yet, but from what I understand, that grandparent stage, it's much the same, but it's even more so, because at that stage, I think you're recognizing you've got a family. It's not just a kid. There's a whole family. You're the patriarch of a family. You're the matriarch of a family. And the responsibility that is felt to now bring up these multiple generations behind. So there's this shifting of our focus that happens in that. And so here we have Elijah now refocusing the responsibility that he feels, the desire that he now has, the concern for preparing this next generation prophet to continue this mission that is much bigger than Elijah. But now you have him refocused and re-energized as well. And so there's the hope. We've had this great hero of faith who up until now, we built him up as being super heroic. And now tonight we see he's a human hero. See him in all of his humanity. We see him physically broken, we see him spiritually broken, but we also see the hope that he has. And the overriding thread through this, as you read through there with Elijah, is just to look up. Elijah looked down, and there's a danger in looking down, taking our eyes off of the Lord, taking our eyes off of God. When you're used in a mighty way, look up. Don't focus on what was just happened. Look up at the one who has used you. When you've stood strong against the enemy, look up. When you're tempted to start focusing on the gifts and the tools that you've been given, look up at the one who has given those to you, and not focus on those. It's very tempting, and it's very easy in the busyness of life to become very impressed with ourselves, become very impressed with what we think we have accomplished, with our abilities, our own accomplishments, particularly in good times. It's also just as easy in those down times, the tough times, to become despondent, to become discouraged, to become depressed, like we see Elijah as well. Elijah performed these incredible miracles, tirelessly opposing this evil, very carnal, very wicked king and queen. Spent years toiling away in service, and eventually and gradually he takes his eyes off of the Lord and he breaks. But what a good and awesome God that we serve, because he's a God who refreshes and he restores and he refocuses and he re-energizes and he reaffirms and he reminds. But our eyes need to remain fixed on him. So we need to look up.